It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this next panel. My name is Giulia Malerbi, and I'm the Global Policy Lead here at the Aquatic Life Institute. I'm really thrilled about the panel that we have ahead of us. Just bear with me. I just need to go through a few housekeeping reminders for our attendees. So the audience is muted and the camera off upon entry, as you've noticed, but there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So feel free to put your questions there and we will answer them at the end of all the presentations. Just letting you know, this session is being recorded. And here at the Aquatic Life Institute, we have policy of zero tolerance for harassment and discrimination. So please engage in respectful and productive discussions. On the logistics side, this session will last 50 minutes. We have 3 amazing speakers, as well as plenty of time for Q&A at the end. The title of today's session is Updates from Aquatic Animal Alliance Coalition members. And what we will hear today is updates from members of the Aquatic Animal Alliance on their latest work in international campaigning and policy. I will just briefly introduce the panelists and then give the floor to them. So first we have Morgan Janovic. I think I butchered your last name, but I hope you'll forgive me for that. Partnership Coordinator at Green Rev. Amro Hussein, Senior Public Affairs Lead at the Humane League UK. And last but not least, Abigail Penny, Executive Director at Animal Equality UK. So without further ado, Morgan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me share the screen as I have prepared the presentation. Just give me one more second and I will be with you very shortly. That's perfect. We are here, we're at home. Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan Janovic, and you did pronounce it very well. Thank you so much for that. I'm a partnership coordinator at Green Rev Institute and a board member at Green Rev Institute, a green think tank that is the initiator of the first coalition in Poland working towards a food system transition. So maybe briefly about Rev, we advocate, watchdog, and create a front of civil society organizations from animal rights, climate, and human rights. We also create and bring together experts from all fields, including politics, science, business, NGOs, media activism, for change for animals, planet, and of course, people. We put our values of collaboration, partnership, systemic action, and inclusion of young people into action in Future Food for Climate Coalition, for the European Vegan Summit, in our daily advocacy work. Future Food for Climate has already 63 organizations from Poland and Ukraine. The European Vegan Summit is our big success with more than 100 speakers from 5 continents and 1,400 people who attended the event online. We know that to help animals, you have to take them off the plates. We know also that it won't work without connecting the dots and showing how animal agriculture sector is destroying human life, health, planet, and climate biodiversity and our future. Going to the point, thank you very much for this great opportunity to participate in this event. We greatly value Aquatic Animal Alliance as a partner, an institution that builds partnership and debate around the most forgotten aquatic animals, and as an expert on such a difficult topic as the welfare and protection of fish and aquatic animal rights. I'm extremely pleased to be here in such a great group. I would like to talk more about the project that we carry out as a Green Rev Institute. It is entitled Bringing Fish Back to Water during the election, with the support of the Eurogroup for Animals. The problem in Poland is the lack of awareness that fish feel, that they feel pain, and the lack of awareness of the fact that fish are farmed animals. And this part of the farming sector is contributing to environmental, health, and of course, social costs. The aim of the project is to raise the awareness and sensitivity about fish welfare, fish as sentient beings, and the impact of fish and fisheries on climate, biodiversity among decision makers. when it comes to Poland, we have had parliamentary elections. Then we have local government elections and the European Parliament elections, of course, at the European level. And the issue of fish rights and welfare is still absent from the public debate and is also widely neglected in political agendas. And as part of the project, we will hold 4 round tables with decision makers, experts, and civil society organizations. We also plan to issue a summary with recommendations, which will be sent as a call to action to key political leaders in Poland. But going further, fish in Poland have no voice. It is still a practice to keep a live carp in a bathtub before the Christmas. And carp today is not a living being, but simply an element of tradition on the Christmas table. Today, Poland is the main producer of carp in the European Union, with domestic production accounting for around 30% of EU production. And Poland is also a huge catch of herring and sprat. We are talking about more than 60 tons of sprats and around 39 tons of herring fish in 2020. So in news on the environmental catastrophe in the Oder River circulated around the world very recently, and this strategy showed that vocabulary we use is stripped of all subjectivity for fish. It also showed that we see climate and environmental tragedies and dramas only from the perspective of cost and human and harm to human. And we forget that non-human animals are the victims of climate change, of the lack of nature conservation, and headlines in the newspapers presented in the news used vocabulary such as tons of dead fish. We pay no attention to the fact that millions of living beings have been poisoned. So far, it is not clear what happened, and in a blame-shifting contest, it is difficult to pick a winner. Poland is also a country where we have around 2.5 million of active fisher persons, and the number of Polish Angling Association alone numbers more than 600,000. And fishing is widely regarded as entertainment, as form of relaxation. It is not connected with suffering, killing animals like hunting. Still, catching a fish, inflicting pain on it, and throwing it mutilated into the water is simply associated with a way of spending leisure time, and photographs with fish are shown completely without any shame. And this makes a discussion very difficult, because it does not give a space to show that fish are sentient beings. After all, if we can catch and release them, is there harm done, right? So the subject of fish is non-existent in public debate in Poland. We're approaching a very intense time, as I've mentioned before, which is the election marathon. Autumn 2023, we've got the parliamentary election, spring 24, local government election, and there's a European election waiting just in line. And as part of the bringing fish back to water during the election project, we want not only to increase the involvement of decision makers in bringing the topic of fish rights and welfare into this discussion, but we want to raise awareness, build cooperation with experts and CSOs. And Poland will receive as much as 500 million euro between 2021 and 2027 under the European Maritime Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund. The question is, will this money support the objectives contained in the European Green Deal? Do they include measures to transform the food system towards more sustainable? It is very important to bring the issue of fish welfare into the public debate, the political agendas on climate and environmental protection. Just as politicians started talking about factory farming, for example, they must have noticed the problem of diesel in chicken feed or bird flu. They must have noticed that you cannot talk about farmed animals without talking about fish. We're now at the very crucial moment. Parliamentary local government and European Parliament elections are ahead of us. And now is the time to spread awareness, to involve decision makers, experts, and NGOs in advocating for fish. And without legislative protection, which does not exist at the moment, fish will continue to be left out of the public debate. And we also want to seize the moment because we realize that green transition of the food system and animal welfare has gone down the drain. The war in Ukraine, the economic crisis, inflation, yesterday's announcement that Poland will not receive recovery plan and EU 2021-2027 funds if it does not meet the condition related to the rule of law. And these topics of public debate, energy poverty enters the debate, but what about food poverty? Fish deserve to be on the agenda in relation to animal protection and the welfare of farmed animals on political agendas. Going next, Green Wreath Institute organized the European Vegan Summit, and the summit was organized in the collaboration with 53 organizations and companies from all around the world. And European Vegan Summit was held under the patronage of the European Parliament. Speakers and experts came from 5 continents. Almost 1,400 participants from all over the world registered to participate in the European Vegan Summit. And the event featured 17 panels and exhibition with photos. One of the exhibition was directly related to fish. And the exhibition was created in the collaboration with the We Animal Media and was called How We Treat Aquatic Life. And feel free to check out Andrew Scovron's video and his strong words on fish farming. So as part of the Bringing Fish Back to Water during the election project, we'll hold 4 round tables. There will be a fish as farmed animals, which will take place already next week on Tuesday. Then we have impact of fishery on climate and biodiversity. Then the third one will be investigation on fish farms. And the fourth one, abuse and harm to animals in different types of industrial or factory farms. The first roundtable will already take place next week. And we invite future Food for Climate coalition partners, organizations, key experts in fish welfare, decision makers at the European and national level, and youth parties active in Poland to participate in our debates. And as part of the project, we'll submit 3 written questions to the Ministry of Climate and Environment, Ministry of Health, and Ministry of Agriculture on aspects of fish farming in cooperation with decision makers. At the end of the project, we'll develop and present a list of recommendations, which will then be sent to the decision makers, decision-making party before the election in 2023-2024. Such activities have a real impact on shaping the debate in the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Morgan. This was really interesting. Thanks for the knowledge that you shared with us as well. And I'm really curious. I have some questions already, but as said, we'll reply to all of them at the end of the session. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. And meanwhile, we'll pass it on to Amro. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just try and share my screen here as well. Great. Is that up there? Can everyone see that? Great.
Yeah, that's good.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're having a good conference so far. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to speak about the Humane League UK, but also specifically about our Forgotten Fish campaign. So quickly, for those who maybe aren't aware, the Humane League UK exists to end the abuse of animals raised for food. We've been designated by the animal charity evaluators as one of their top charities for 9 consecutive years for our effective campaigning, which has typically been focused on laying hens and broiler chickens, but we began legislative work for fishes last year. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that today. I'm going to talk through what is the current legal status of farm fish in the UK, what ask we developed as part of our campaign in response to that status, why we chose that ask, what we have done so far in the campaign, and kind of what are our next campaign steps. It's important to stress that this campaign isn't one. This is an ongoing thing. We're learning too. We'll no doubt make mistakes, but hopefully we can share some of our work now that will help others, and we can continue this conversation about how we advocate effectively for farmed fish. So the current legal status. So quickly, farmed fish do have legal recognition in the UK. They are recognized as sentient in law through legal instruments such as the Animal Sentience Act, which came into place this year. They're also recognized in the primary slaughter regulations in this country, which are the welfare of animals at the time of killing regulations, otherwise known as WATOC. And these regulations require that farmed animals, that producers avoid unnecessary suffering in how they treat farm animals. So that's positive, but there is a huge legal disparity here between how terrestrial farm animals are treated within those regulations and how farm fish are treated. Within WATOC, the welfare for animals at time of killing regulations, there is detailed species-specific guidance for terrestrial farm animals on how producers are to avoid suffering, but there is nothing like that for farm fish. So essentially, the situation that we have is that the industry is being left to self-regulate. The vague requirement to avoid unnecessary suffering means that it's very difficult to effectively enforce that requirement. There's limited legal enforcement and almost no kind of welfare or government inspections of welfare. So we just have kind of a vacuum for farm fish, and little we can do to punish those who don't stun before slaughter. So what's our ask then? What we're calling for is for UK governments to make sure that the stunning for farmed fish with species-specific detailed requirements of key parameters is included in regulations, and just essentially bringing the legislative protection for farmed fish up to the same standards that it is already for terrestrial farm animals. Now, why this ask specifically? There are obviously, as we all know very well, lots of problems in fish farming. So why are we focusing on stunning specifically? There's lots of reasons, but I think there are two principal reasons that we can discuss. First, we're trying to aim for a significant suffering reduction. Obviously, slaughter is a relatively short time in the life of farmed fish, but slaughter without stunning is extremely stressful and painful. So there's an important suffering reduction issue here. But there's also a question about pragmatic assessment of our potential for success. We knew that fish campaigning would be extremely difficult because there hasn't been much campaigning work done before in this area, and kind of similarly to what Morgan mentioned in their presentation, there just isn't a lot of awareness or discussion about farm fish welfare issues at all. So we needed to focus on an ask that was relatively achievable and that could act as a platform for getting fish welfare on the political and parliamentary agenda. And the reason this specific ask, we saw it as relatively achievable, is because there was existing expert support for it that we found through our research from organizations like the British Veterinary Association, but also because majority of the industry are trying to implement stunning in some form. So we're hoping there wouldn't be an enormous industry level pushback. And also because this legislation exists in Norway. So there is a tangible, comparable example that we could point decision makers to from the UK. We could point towards Norway. So that's why we selected that ask. So what have we done so far? More research, I think, was where we started from. We had the research to really decide what was our ask, but also just figure out how to communicate our ask, communicate the story. We're starting from a relatively low base when it comes to farm fish welfare. So we had to ask, what is the effective messaging? How do we speak about farm fish, and what is the current level of understanding? So we worked with different agencies, we had focus testing, we experimented with different messaging. And we actually have a guidance document online that is available online that shows some of the lessons we learned and how we can speak about a farm fish welfare. We also did polling. We tried to figure out what the public and also what parliamentarians believed about farmed fish welfare. And we found some interesting and encouraging data, such as that only 8% of UK adults are convinced that farm fish don't feel pain. And actually that 71% believe that they should have equivalent legal protections as terrestrial farm animals. And time again, we found that this kind of comparison messaging was very effective. It wasn't all rosy though either. We found some challenges, again, kind of similar to what you discussed, Morgan, and we found that people don't necessarily know anything about fish farming or even that fish farming exists. So again, starting at a really low base. But with this research, with kind of understanding of key targets and demographics and how to communicate, we decided to then start trying to get out there, trying to raise awareness and try and communicate the campaign. So the first thing we did was, create a video and petition with footage that was helpfully shared from an animal quality investigation. We put together this video about things the government doesn't want you to know about fish farming, about the reality. And we had a petition as well, trying to show that there is public will and appetite for more farmed fish legislative protection. We also began parliamentary engagement, specifically targeting animal conscious political groups. So there is a parliamentary group for animal welfare, and alongside the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation and Animal Equality and this group, we had the first ever parliamentary meeting, which was dedicated exclusively to fish welfare, again, trying to get fish welfare on their agenda. And we similarly presented to a Scottish parliamentary group on animal welfare. We've also been doing kind of traditional supporter engagement with parliamentarians, trying to get them to send emails to their MPs, send emails to government departments. But we've also tried to do a few things that are a little bit more creative. On the screen, you can see kind of hand-drawn birthday cards that we sent to Scottish leaders. Drawings that people made that we've turned into postcards. We've sent them, a lot of decision makers, this lovely children's book about fish and what their sentience and how they can feel, etc. So just trying to be a wee bit more creative about it. But really, one of the big things they've been trying to do to build awareness about farmed fish and their welfare is trying to get stories in the press, reaching out to journalists, trying to get them interested in this story. And you can see there on the screen some headlines that we've had, like a recent article in The Observer, which discussed this issue, and kind of headlines in The Guardian and other press. And a lot of this has come about from just trying to consistently look for opportunities to get stories that might engage people a little bit. So for example, the one in The Guardian was about the fact that we found out through Freedom of Information requests that no government bodies were actually doing inspections at all of fish welfare sites. And that was quite striking. And we were able to utilize that to get a story in the press. But then, so moving on from that, what are our next steps? So the situation in the UK is quite interesting now, because there's a body of government experts known as the Animal Welfare Committee, and these experts are requested by the government to advise them on different animal welfare issues. And the governments in the UK have called on this committee to produce a report to looking at the welfare of farmed fish at the time of slaughter. Now, this committee actually already produced a very similar report, which made the recommendation for stunning that is the ask for our campaign. But that recommendation wasn't adopted by the government. Essentially, the report just sat on the shelf. So what we're really aiming to do with this opinion, which is expected to come out in the next few months, is assuming that it makes similar recommendations to last time, is to really make as much noise as possible so that this time the report doesn't sit on the shelf, that the government has to pay attention to it. So we're really trying to use an array of campaign tactics, but to target key ministers and essentially demonstrate that there's a broad coalition of supporters for this legislative change. So some of the campaign tactics we're looking at, literally just this morning, we had the unveiling of a new artwork. We collaborated with an artist, and this was at the British Parliament, and we're trying to use art to start a conversation about fish welfare and to use it for social change. But when the opinion comes out, really what we're hoping to do is try and work with other animal protection organizations to coordinate our response and again show this broad coalition of actors. So I mentioned working with NGOs, but we're also trying to work with the private sector and work with businesses and sustainable restaurants and other organizations who care about high welfare. We're also going to try and engage celebrity response to build awareness among this in the public too. Probably not going to get that celebrity specifically, but we're going to try and get celebrity awareness going forward to help raise the attention on this issue. And we'll be going back to Parliament as well. So we didn't just try and have one meeting with those parliamentarians, but again, similar to Morgan's presentation, trying to have series of meetings with parliamentary groups so that when the opinion is out, we can go back to them and talk more about farm fish and talk about different aspects of the campaign. And finally, we're just really trying to build grassroots supports, but really targeting that towards key ministerial constituencies. So what this slide is supposed to represent is that we're going to be going to key government constituencies with this little food van and giving out free food and trying to engage people on the ground, having them contact their parliamentarians, and just really trying to use any tactics we can to get people engaged on this issue, which, as we mentioned, they don't really know anything about it for the most part among the general public. So I think I'll leave it there, but happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amro. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for the work you do. And also, if you manage to get The Rock, I think he would be a great celebrity to support the work. So keep me in the loop in case. So if you have questions for Amro, also put them in the chat. And last but not least, Abigail, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Julia. I'll just share my screen now. Okay, hopefully you can see that all right. Great. And also, Amro, I will definitely be first in the queue for that vegan plant-based fish. So save me some, put it aside. Okay, so I think Amro actually covered some of the things that I'll be running through today as well, because as he mentioned, we've been working very closely in collaboration with this, which I think has been one of the biggest successes of the campaign and is why we're seeing so much progress. So luckily for me, he's done a lot of the explaining of some of the difficult, tricky legal things. So I will probably bypass some of those parts as we go, but just to give you an overview of where we are, today I'll be talking about the case for stronger legislation and increased oversight for farmed fish. So firstly, before I do go on, I know Morgan and Amro have already done a great job, but I do want to say a massive thank you to Julia and to the whole team. You know, it's been absolutely exceptionally well organised and just so easy and convenient for all of us, I think. So a big bravo and a massive thank you from all of us. Then in terms of me, I don't know, for those that are here, in case you don't already know me, as Julia mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Animal Equality UK. So we are a leading international animal protection organisation. We have offices in 8 different countries. So today I'll be talking a little bit about who we are, what we're calling for, why we're calling for it, and how we're achieving progress. So as I briefly mentioned, I have the very good fortune of being at the helm of the UK branch of Animal Equality, which means I get to oversee a team of serious high achievers, and together we release groundbreaking investigations, we carry out strategic legal initiatives, and we conduct major public awareness campaigns in defence of farmed animals. We are an effective altruist organisation, so that means that we focus our efforts on the animals who suffer most extremely and on the largest scale, and of course, that includes fish. So we've actually carried out work for fish in other countries where animal equality already exists. So in India, you'll see an image here, where over recent years we investigated the entire process of fish farming. Amongst other things, we looked into the atrocity that is fish milking, the breeding of fish in small overcrowded ponds, and the brutal beating of fish. We've also investigated tilapia farms in Mexico, where we documented fish being crushed against one another in an overcrowded container, cannibalism in farms where fish had not been fed for 6 months, and ponds where fish had very little oxygen and were exposed to direct sunlight. In the US, we visited one of the largest catfish operations, responsible for killing over 20,000 catfish per day. We filmed the animals being dumped from a truck onto a conveyor belt that then leads them to the machines for stunning, and most of the fish were awake and fully conscious on the belt for up to an hour. And of course, today's presentation will focus specifically on our legal advocacy campaign in the UK, as with up to 77 million fish reared and slaughtered in the UK every year, it is of course critical that this is a focal point for the UK office too. Currently, Animal Equality's campaign, just like Amro was mentioning, is geared towards bringing about meaningful, species-specific legislation for farmed fish at the time of killing. But ultimately, our end goal as an organisation is to end the suffering of fish and to encourage consumers to stop eating these animals entirely. But of course, in parallel with this, we need to fight for the animals that are currently trapped in the system, and with the aquaculture industry set to grow exponentially in the UK over the coming years, it's more important than ever that they have these legal protections in place. So by securing legislation, we can hold the industry to account and we can ensure that there's increased transparency as well. So I will whiz past this one. I won't go into too much detail, but our ask includes these 3 key points amongst other things. So the first, as Amro already spoke about, is a call for species-specific welfare at the time of killing regulations for farmed fish, but also for so-called cleaner fish who are used to eat the lice off of the animals who are being farmed. We're also calling for frequent announced and unannounced government inspections, and also a system where sites are licensed so that those licenses can be revoked when the farms are found to be breaking the law. And we're also calling for mandatory CCTV. So why are we focusing on slaughter specifically? So the first is that it clearly eliminates severe suffering. So due to the legal ambiguity and the fact that fish are currently yet to receive this legislation, farmed fish face the very real prospect of suffering terribly in their final moments in life. They might bleed to death, be left to asphyxiate, slowly and painfully die on ice, or be beaten. Currently, there are tens of millions of fish that are raised and killed in the UK every year, so the potential for reducing their suffering is significant. The second is that there is political openness here. So although the government has been stalling on this for a few years now, we do know that this is an area that they're open to legislating on, and they've already commissioned research as far back as 2014. So although they certainly do need a strong push in the right direction still, it isn't a closed door. There's also a reputational opportunity for the UK. The UK is clearly falling behind many of its EU counterparts, or Norway, as was mentioned before, which gives the government a greater incentive to act and ensure that we're the leader that we always claim to be. It's also a first step in legislation. So it's a foot in the door to give future legislation for fish, and it allows us to continue raising the bar, setting legal standards that hold the industry to account. This is especially important because, as I say, the aquaculture industry is sadly due to expand over the coming years. There is also alignment in our asks. So generally speaking, there is alignment across animal advocates and experts as to what needs to be done to significantly minimise the suffering of fish at the time of killing. Also, the equipment already exists. There's simply a lack of oversight and enforcement of how it's then being used. So without laws, there is currently uncertainty for some producers as to whether fish need to be stunned before killing. And also no one from any official regulatory body is responsible for actually checking the CCTV footage, for example. And then lastly, one that we've been pleasantly surprised by is the public appeal. So because like any slaughter, the killing of fish is entirely needless and gruesome and bloody, we must do all that we can to defend our underwater friends. And slaughter is naturally a topic that appeals to the masses. So by getting increased petition signatures and building greater momentum, getting attention for fish in the media, our hope is that over time we can also encourage consumers to increase their empathy towards these creatures. So our strategy in a nutshell is fourfold. So the first is that we evidence there's a problem and we mobilise the people. The second is that we liaise with experts to develop a clear set of legal standards. The next one, which is where we're at right now, is persuading the bodies who are influencing the government to take those standards on board as their own. And then lastly, once those are published, we want to present the standards to the policymakers and call for their support by bringing in place new and meaningful legislation with a clear focus on enforcement measures. So all of our successes have actually stemmed off the back of Animal Equality's pretty groundbreaking investigation. So in February of last year, we released a first of its kind expose into a Scottish salmon company slaughterhouse. So despite the fact that this company had invested millions of pounds into stunning machinery, we found a significant number of salmon were still displaying consciousness at the time of killing. This meant that many salmon had their gills cut while they were fully conscious. Some were clubbed multiple times, and in one case, 7 times. Also, due to the fast pace of the kill line, we found that animals were falling to the floor and just being left to suffocate on the ground. So while certification schemes were in place for this company, it did fail to prevent this suffering. And with no clear legal requirement in place, there's little that we can do to hold the industry to account. So the investigation was covered in an exclusive with The Times. It also prompted features in numerous other publications, and our potential media reach to date is over 104 million, which means that people all around the world are becoming aware of the extreme suffering endured by fish at slaughter. In tandem with the investigation release, we coordinated an open letter to the government endorsed by 70 world-leading animal experts and advocates calling for this legislation to be put in place. This suffering is possible because at the time of filming, there were no laws in place for farmed fish, but there was also a serious lack of government monitoring. As was mentioned before, following conversations with animal equality representatives and freedom of information requests sent by the Humane League, it was confirmed at the end of last year that routine welfare-oriented inspections are not a legal requirement in fish slaughterhouses, i.e. there were no welfare checks being carried out, despite the fact that this is a multi-billion-pound industry. So without any formal audits, the suffering of fish in UK abattoirs runs the risk of going entirely undetected, and the responsibility is then being put on animal protection organisations to expose fish suffering when really it ought to be the role of the government. So that alarming discovery then led Animal Equality to work in conjunction with the influential Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation to present the case for stronger oversight for fish by way of regular inspections and mandatory CCTV. We also took the opportunity to call for mortality data, inspection results, and CCTV feeds to be published centrally, publicly, and immediately by the commissioning body to ensure greater transparency of the industry, because of course there's little point in us pushing for new laws to be put in place if they exist solely on paper and are not being enforced in practice. So lastly, we are though encouraged, so to end on a high, we are seeing some really positive progress that's already underway. So following the investigation and a series of meetings with our team and other animal groups, as well as government officials, it's now been confirmed that inspections at fish slaughterhouses are now a legal requirement for 1 year under Scottish law. This is a direct result of the work that we and fellow animal advocacy organisations have been carrying out. Clearly, there's more to be done, but this is undoubtedly a landmark moment, as too is the fact that, as Amro mentioned, just a few months ago, fish welfare was debated by the UK Parliament for the first time ever. And of course, we have the ongoing consultation underway, so we continue to work closely with the committee to make sure that the recommendations they put out are as strong as they can be. And once they are in place, we'll lobby the MPs across Scotland and the UK to adopt those new laws as quickly as possible. So as a final comment, I'd like to leave you with this quote from world-leading aquatic animal expert, Dr. Lynn Snedden. There is no doubt, of course, that fish are currently forgotten when it comes to legal protection, and their suffering is definitely going unnoticed, but this can change. The UK has the opportunity to implement stronger legal protections for fish that can set a standard for how fish are seen across the rest of the world. So we just need the political will to make it a reality and a few nudges from animal protection groups, I think. So I'm pleased to see where we are, and I think we've got our work cut out for us, but we're heading in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for this presentation. And actually, thank you for finishing on a good, positive tone. I was also, feeling a little bit dragged down by seeing everything that all the time comes up in investigations, but it's essential, the work you're doing. So thank you for this. We're just going to move into questions. We have about 10 minutes. I'm gonna start for a question that came for Morgan, but I think the others can jump in if they want. So what common language most effectively helps open doors with legislators, climate change, global sustainability goals, or other?
Thank you so much for this question. Well, what I can say is that the work with member organizations from the Future Food for Climate Coalition helped us to understand the language and the way how we can sensitize people, and that the main thing is to raise awareness of decision makers. And we try to build new strategies. We find petition and street protest more and more difficult in Poland, because today my country is a state of protest and petitions because of political action against human rights and climate. That is why we understood that the key to success is to cooperate, engage, build critical mass, and use the resources such as skills, knowledge of other CSOs. And our message goes through them to local communities, and we can focus on advocacy and cooperation with decision makers to provide to those who decide the knowledge and awareness. And we need to understand that the main public message today is energy, high life prices, elections. We need to integrate fish welfare into farmed animals debate into broken food system debate, and broken food system debate into climate debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Morgan. I think that was an excellent answer. I'm not sure if Amber and Abigail want to jump in with more thoughts.
No, I think she nailed that one.
I have a question for Amro, but I think it can work for Abigail too, since you both touched on this point, and I'm really curious about this as well. So we've highlighted that there is a big gap between land, farmed animals, and fish. Unfortunately, we're aware of that. But I wonder, like, do you think that depends on a pure empathy issue with the general public, and that's why politicians or stakeholders do not take that into account? Or is there maybe lack of knowledge behind, or other reasons?
Thanks, it's a great question. I think it is a mixture of things. I think that the point you allude to there about empathy and people finding it slightly more difficult to relate to fish potentially on an empathetic level is a factor. But what we found is when we were communicating with the public and doing our research, that when we explained to them the situation and that the anomaly, the kind of disparity between farmed fish and other terrestrial farm animals, people got it for the most part. There was a level of understanding there and a willingness to support it. So I think there is also just a huge issue about the level of awareness and education that we have about it. You know, I speak to parliamentarians, and just like the public, sometimes they have literally no idea that fish farming is a thing in the UK. And so when you're trying to campaign, you are starting up from this very low preliminary level that you have to explain all these things in the first place. And then there's also a reticence to be potentially the first people to talk about something in case they are seen to be foolish later on. You know, they don't have the support of having a well-established campaign and a well-established communication from their constituents and things like that. So everyone is just a little bit cagey, I think, about engaging on it because they just don't know that much about it. So I think there is a bit of just the kind of natural difficulties in empathizing with fish, but I think a lot of that can be overcome with education and awareness. It's just we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was going to actually comment on your answer, just saying, well, if you think probably 10 years ago, we might not even have to go that far. Let's go 5 years ago. Probably a lot of people wouldn't have the same empathy with chickens that they have today. We have a long way to go, but I see your point. Abigail, actually, I have like a connected question for you on this. So we know that Animal Equality does a lot of investigations, and that's a big chunk of your work. So I wonder, how important do you think is to conduct these investigations at the same time that you conduct legal work? Like, does it have to do with raising awareness, creating empathy, involving the public, or any other reason?
Really good question. Obviously I'm biased, but I would say extremely important. I mean, for all of the victories that we've seen, I would say arguably they started and then snowballed off the back of that investigation. So I think the only caveat with that is that we have to fill the role, and I'm fine with this, but you have to fill the role of bad cop and then allow for others to step in as good cop, for example. So, if you are exposing the industry for carrying out activities that you believe should be illegal or are illegal or are not, the laws are too ambiguous to know, then they're naturally not going to particularly like that. So we're poking at the bear a little bit. I think that works, but I don't think it's necessarily the one and only tactic to be used. I do think it's a very powerful one though. So it has definitely worked to our advantage to have that footage, because otherwise, as we all know, these industries have a lot of money and very good marketing teams, it seems, and they're very able to say that everything they do is by the book, and actually it was evidence and proof that's not necessarily the case, and it helps to then encourage the public to get on side and feel mobilized around the issue.
Yeah, that's for sure. I always wonder how you navigate, when you are in legal settings and maybe something is being discussed because there was an investigation that was public a few months before. So I imagine it's a slippery place to be, but yeah, definitely helps to raise awareness and highlight the issue. Let me see. Okay, I have another question. This can work for anyone, but I think this was mostly because we heard a little bit more about the UK. So what suggestions do you have for advocates that work in less progressive countries in terms of animal welfare, where, for example, basic animal welfare legislation is lacking?
Looks like Amro might want to say something. I'll let him go first.
Go, no, please. Okay, well then I might as well. Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think, to be honest, I think a lot of the lessons that we're applying in the UK context are also, in terms of trying to build awareness and interest in this issue, are applicable from coming for a lower level as well. So we do have this recognition of the sentience of farm fish in law now, but what that actually translates to in practice hasn't been an enormous thing. So we're still really trying to do a lot of work to kind of, as Abby mentioned as well, develop the evidence, present that evidence, use it to convince decision makers of the reality around fish sentience. So we're still doing that work. We haven't kind of achieved that, and we're not in a situation where all parliamentarians are agreed about this and can move forward. And we might be a bit more advanced in that discussion, but the fundamentals of that, I think, are still similar, to really be finding ways to communicate the well-established scientific evidence here on fish sentience in ways that are engaging for parliamentarians and for the public, so that they will be willing to take up the issue. And I think we're still figuring out kind of creative ways to do that. I mean, as I mentioned, we're trying to use art today to try and engage people on that, and that's usually a powerful tool for creating social change. But kind of like what Morgan alluded to as well, getting people in a room, showing them the evidence, talking to them, having kind of panels and discussions. I think a lot of the tools that we discussed today are applicable across contexts.
Yeah, I mean, I think Amro covered that perfectly. I think just to add to that as well, obviously we only see this from a UK context, but actually I would really say it's worth, each country developing something that works for their own, because it may be that you just can't, you're not in that space right now or on that journey right now for the public to get behind you. I don't think that's always that critical. It's very helpful, but I think actually right now in the UK that makes sense, but it may not in other countries. And it might be that groups like the Fish Welfare Initiative are working directly with farmers in the Philippines and with them in India, trying to get them to make individual changes on the ground, because that works better in those countries. So I think it's really just got to be adapted to where you're currently based and what you think is going to be most influential right now.
If I can only add from my perspective, so the Protection of Animal Act in Poland does not contain a special provision for fish. We still have a way to go, but I think there are some proposals. We have MEP Dr. Sylwia Spurek, who has proposed the 5 for animals over a year ago, which would have a wonderful impact on humans, animals, and the climate. So we just need more support in this regard. So I think more approval from the political parts. Yeah.
Thank you. I totally agree. I know we are out of time. I just have one last question, and because I think it'd be interesting for Morgan, but then if the others want to join, I think it'd be interesting. So we were asked, what can single individuals / activists do to add pressure to increase the topic of animal welfare? For example, like Amro mentioned, like contacting the representative to ensure that these topics are high on their agenda. Do you have any practical tips for activists that want to support your work?
Of course. I think like there's a great potential in working on the local level. So have a conversation with the local leaders, political leaders. Go to local parties, youth parties, have a conversation about that, introduce them to the topic. And just start from the very small things, like prepare some presentation in your school, like we do. We share knowledge about animal rights, animal welfare in high schools or among youth political parties. And it works because then they go out and they share knowledge, and it can bring a great impact.
I don't know if
just to add to that. Yeah, I was just going to add that, you know, I think it's very important, especially in a UK context as well, given how much the aquaculture industry is forecasted to grow. Just trying to encourage people to reduce or eliminate fish from their diet is also extremely helpful, because this is becoming a bigger and a bigger problem to try to solve, with more animals being killed, and you know, it's quite unwieldy that way. Whereas if we can try and curb that, it will help us a lot. So I think Morgan put it perfectly, you know, getting people to contact their local MPs or the local councillors, or go to schools, go to hospitals, but at the same time making that individual change can be done in parallel and really will have a massive impact.
And I totally agree with what was said. And just to add a bit about that, contacting your local representatives, your MP or such, I think sometimes people aren't sure necessarily the potential impact of that, or you know, how far it goes. But I think in the context of something like aquaculture and farm fish welfare, there's a really big potential to have impact here, because you'll generally be one of starting communications with MPs on an issue that they've never heard about before, and we'll be pioneering and kind of getting this on their agenda. And it makes it so much easier for organizations like ourselves and others when we approach a parliamentarian to talk to them about something, and they can be like, oh yeah, we just got an email about that, or we got some letters in about that. It has actually a much bigger impact sometimes than you can appreciate. So I really encourage people to do that.
Thank you so much. I wish we had more time to go over more questions, but this has been such an interesting panel. Thank you so much to Abigail, Amro, and Morgan for the amazing presentations and all the discussions afterward. Thank you for the audience for joining and listening and sending their questions. I just wanted to leave you with a brief information. So actually 2 of them. First is that the Aquatic Life Institute, as I mentioned in some sessions before, we are creating a focus group on aquatic animal policy initiatives and opportunities, which will be housed under the AAA. So therefore, we will be inviting you know, colleagues or members that work within the aquatic animal policy landscape or are interested in working in that. So if you're interested, send me an email. I'll be reaching out myself directly to people, but if you have a colleague that you think would be a good fit, please tell them about this opportunity that will be soon formalized. And finally, I want to share that we at the Aquatic Life Institute will be present at COP27 in Egypt in November. because we will be calling global leaders to further the conversations on aquatic animal welfare and the nexus that it has with climate, sustainability, and everything we just discussed. So we would really appreciate if you could share some of our social media. Thank you, Priska, for putting that in the chat. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. Thanks again to the panelists. The next session is just in 10 minutes.